radar field of view for perhaps 5 or 6 minutes. Aegis BMD ships might also be in position to track the missile's flight.
The trajectory of the missiles headed from North Korea to Guam would take them over the southern part of Japan. They'd fly just south of Hiroshima, and at that point they'd be at an altitude of about 700 kilometers. So, Tom, if the U.S. determined that these missiles were actually a threat to Guam, what systems would be called upon to respond?
If the U.S. determines the missiles to be a potential threat, we might try to shoot them down using various missile defense interceptors. This might include the sea-launched Standard Missile-3, launched from an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, or a land-based THAAD battery based in Guam, or some combination of the two. Both systems have an excellent test record, but neither has been used in an operational context against a ballistic missile fired in anger.
And all of this would happen within a relatively short period of time. So North Korea said it would take about 17 minutes time of flight to reach Guam. Others have said it could take as little as 14 minutes. Of course, it depends on the specific trajectory used. A more lofted trajectory would take longer and rise to a higher altitude in space, while a more shallow trajectory would take a bit less time and stay at a lower altitude.
So an intercept attempt with an Aegis Standard missile would be outside the atmosphere, close to its apogee during its midcourse, or during its downward descent with the THAAD system.
So all of this provides an interesting case study into how such a scenario could unfold and the way U.S. missile defense systems are designed to protect against such threats.
Right. This is the kind of threat that we've seen coming for a long time. This is why the systems are located where they are, the radars and the interceptors, but we hope we don't have to use them. To learn more about both the threat missiles from North Korea and the various missile defense systems, check out missilethreat.csis.org.
The war in Syria represents a new low for the international community. We're seeing a war without law, as well as seemingly a war without end. It's very, very striking that we're living in an age of the bombing of UN convoys, never mind the targeting of hospitals.
So we were so surprised and shocked when we saw our colleagues covered with their blood and giving their last breaths. I don't know how to describe that. It's so hard emotionally. It's like you are losing one of your precious in front of your eyes.
We're witnessing a profound surge of violence against civilians, against health workers, patients, facilities, humanitarian convoys across a full spectrum of countries that is really shredding the accountability and protections that are contained in the Geneva Conventions.
The attack on Kunduz was a sustained attack over an hour, despite the fact that all the parties knew us, had our GPS coordinate. We must say that it was our biggest loss in terms of lives. 42 people died, 14 of our staff.
This was a tragic mistake.
This is a period when there's the danger of vacuum around the world and a danger for the abuse of power by states that are strong enough to do so. The international sense of conscience and consciousness that led to the responsibility to protect in the early 2000s has certainly been eroded.
People are struggling to respond. They're building clinics and hospitals in underground bunkers. They're documenting these attacks and publishing them. They're taking measures to the UN Security Council.
Stop bombing hospital. Stop bombing health workers.
But up to now, these measures have not had much effect in deterring attacks. But many courageous individuals and groups continue the fight. This is a fight that's going to last well into the future.
We believe that war stopped at the door of our hospital, and we want to preserve that. And we want to preserve access to health care in war zones. That's a battle that's worth to fight.
Space is a critical enabler for military operations and an increasingly important domain of modern warfare. But operating in space is expensive. What would it mean for the U.S. military if costs were reduced significantly?
Start 1, 0.
Disruptive breakthroughs that could significantly reduce the cost of access to space may come in many forms. One of the most pursued methods for reducing the cost of access to space is making launch vehicles less expensive. Building launch vehicles in much greater quantities can enable efficiencies in the manufacturing process, but quantity alone is unlikely to yield order-of-magnitude reductions in costs. Novel forms of propulsion could also one day reduce costs.
But perhaps the most promising disruption is reusability. If a launch vehicle can be reused 10 times with minimal maintenance between flights, it could, in theory, reduce the effective vehicle cost by roughly an order of magnitude. Repairing or reusing satellites in space through on-orbit servicing could also reduce the cost of access to space. Instead of launching a 5,000-kilogram satellite to field a new space capability, one could launch a 500-kilogram payload to upgrade an existing satellite.
A significant reduction in the cost of access to space could enable new military space missions that are not feasible at current costs. Placing conventional weapons in orbit to strike targets on Earth has been explored in the past. One limitation has been the cost of launching the large number of satellites that would be needed to have a similar capability as a fleet of ground-based long-range missiles. An even larger constellation of satellites would be needed for a boost-phase kinetic missile interceptor system. Because the kill vehicle required for a missile intercept is more technologically complex, launch costs are a smaller share of the total cost. A space-based missile interceptor system could also be adapted to strike an adversary's satellites or to defend against anti-satellite missiles launched at friendly satellites.
Lower launch costs could also enable space transportation and logistics for critical military operations. A crewed vehicle system similar to what commercial firms are developing for space tourism could be adapted by the military to deliver small numbers of special operations forces or critical supplies to virtually any location on Earth within 30 to 45 minutes. Many of the disruptions that could reduce the cost of access to space and enable new missions, architectures, and operations for the U.S. military could also provide the same advantages to potential adversaries. Other nations could be incentivized to field space-based systems for ground attack, missile defense, and anti-satellite missions, whether or not the United States pursues such systems. A significant reduction in the cost of launch vehicles in particular could mean a reduction in the cost of long-range missiles, potentially leading to a rapid and uncontrolled proliferation.
Significant cost reductions are not likely until space launch becomes more of a commercial rather than a government activity. But the government has a big role to play. The government can seed key market areas by paying for and sharing risky early R&D on disruptive technologies, and helping commercial companies develop common standards so that a competitive commercial ecosystem emerges. The government can help commercial space grow by purchasing more services rather than using only its own version of these capabilities. Government can be the anchor customer for many of the emerging disruptive commercial technologies on the horizon. Also, the government can make getting to space easier by simplifying government approvals and striking a careful balance to maintain the United States' lead in commercial space while protecting national security.
The emergence of a robust commercial space market and the promise and peril it offers will take time to fully develop, but the nation that shapes this future is likely to benefit the most.
One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
The Defense Acquisition System has given the United States military an unmatched technological advantage for over 70 years. Along with its legendary complexity, it's brought us the Abrams tanks, the nuclear aircraft carrier, the amphibious assault vehicle, and the B-2 bomber. Today it spends more than $300 billion a year, nearly 3 times as much as Amazon's annual worldwide sales. Over 150,000 people and almost 2,000 pages of rules are employed to make sure that money buys what the military needs. And much like Amazon, you can find just about anything in DoD shopping cart. How hard is it to buy all that? Exhibit A, this simple 500-element flowchart that explains how the Defense Acquisition System works. Let's take a closer look at that framework, though. There are three fundamental elements for every acquisition: a need, an appropriation, and a contract. The requirements process defines the need, which is often called a statement of work. The budget process generates the funding, and the contracting process buys the product or service from industry. This structure holds equally for all things in DoD shopping cart, from the simplest to the most complex. For the simplest things, the process can be performed by one government professional in a few days with a requisition order or need, a government purchase card or funding, and a bill of sale or contract. For the most complex acquisitions, hundreds of people are involved in every step of the process over a period of decades. Let's apply this underlying structure to the Pentagon's most complex acquisition program, the Joint Strike Fighter, or F-35. First, the need. In 2000, the Air Force, Navy, and the Marine Corps produced a statement of work for the F-35, also known as an Operational Requirements Document. While there have been some important changes to the document, these basic requirements remain the standard against which the program is judged. Second, the contract. A year later, the DoD awarded Lockheed Martin a contract to develop the F-35 with 3 variants, one for each service. And while Lockheed has been awarded several F-35 related contracts, this initial contract remains in place to this day. Third, the funding. Since the decisive competition kicked off in 1997, Congress has provided 20 years of appropriations for the F-35. The estimated total budget is more than $1 trillion, which includes all the money necessary to develop, produce, and operate thousands of this aircraft for over 50 years. To date, however, only about 10% of that amount has actually been spent. In other words, the F-35 is only now moving past its initial stages. This 3-part underlying structure gives us insight into what makes acquisition work better. As the F-35 illustrates, a well-understood requirement, a clear contract that aligns contractor and government interests, and a realistic budget are crucial building blocks to set early on in the process. Even as we seek new approaches to acquisition, these critical elements will continue to form the foundation of any successful acquisition system.
We want to explore the divergent paths of the developing world and share one of the many stories that paint the modern picture of the global landscape. We'll demonstrate the interplay of good governance, rule of law, and economic growth. The x-axis shows rule of law for a country. Countries on the right have a stronger legal and societal structure. And here we have regulatory quality. The higher you go, the better government can promote a strong business environment. In summary, bottom left bad, top right good. The size of the bubble represents GNI per capita, with larger bubbles indicating higher average income for individual citizens. We looked at 36 countries across income levels, upper middle income in red, middle income in green, and low income in blue. These 4 countries, Bolivia, Haiti, Albania, and Georgia, show the diverging paths of the developing world. In 1996, Bolivia showed strong rule of law and a good business regulatory environment, but you can see that it had a comparable GNI to the other countries. Albania, Georgia, and Haiti performed below average on the indicators. Let's see what happens over the next 20 years in these 4 countries. Remember that Georgia was still newly independent from Soviet rule in 1996 and was struggling with the transition to democracy and a free market economy in its first few years. 2004 protests led to the resignation of Eduard Shevardnadze, who was president since 1995 in what became known as the Rose Revolution. After that, Georgia continued to implement free market reforms and transparent political expression under Mikhail Saakashvili. Despite occasional bumps, the Georgian economy has continued to grow. By 2015, Georgia outperforms China, Russia, Brazil, and many high-income countries in rule of law, business environment, and political voice. Albania is another former Soviet bloc country that has increased openness since 1995, contributing to stable growth. Their progress was tainted by accusations of corruption in their nascent multi-party and capitalist system. Albania's NATO membership in 2009 and its candidacy for EU accession in 2014 incentivized the country to reform and stay on the right path. On the other side is Bolivia. It performed relatively well in 1996 on the rule of law scale, and at least as well as South Africa with its business regulatory environment. After continual improvements until 2003 under President Goñi Sanchez de Lozada, Bolivia descended into bad governance after the election of Evo Morales in 2005. Since then, Bolivia has regressed in part due to nationalistic interference in the economy and the judiciary. Over the 20-year period, Bolivia declined more than almost any country across regulatory, environment, and rule of law metrics. Its economic growth stagnated in comparison to other developing countries, especially Georgia. By 2015, Bolivia, once on a path to development and a rising middle-income country, is worse off than Honduras, Mali, and Pakistan by these metrics. Now let's finally turn to Haiti. It is an example of a country trapped by bad governance and weak rule of law that has enabled a cycle of poverty. The catastrophic 2010 earthquake destroyed infrastructure, sanitation, and health conditions. But Haiti had not demonstrated success even before the earthquake. Despite significant aid, Haiti has languished in underdevelopment. Here are the four divergent countries together. Countries like Georgia move from fragile to developed and stable, from aid to trade, in part thanks to improved laws, a better business environment, and a healthy multi-party democracy. Albania has succeeded in some regards, but it still has a ways to go. Countries like Bolivia took a different path and failed to deliver progress to its citizens. Haiti has not been able to escape poverty and underdevelopment. For the Georgias and Albanias of the world, we need new forms of cooperative relationships, moving from aid to trade, from development assistance to investment and partnership. For the Bolivias and Haitis of the world, we need to ask ourselves, what role can the U.S. and other partners play in returning them to a path of prosperity? Now it's up to us to do something about what we see. Welcome to the 2017 Global Development Forum.
China is rising. Its economy is now the second largest in the world. China is the world's largest trader, having surpassed the United States, and Chinese military capabilities are expanding. In just a few decades, China has moved from the periphery to the center of the international system. But what does that really mean for the world? In some ways, China is a developed country, yet in other ways, it is still developing. China's transformation is often misunderstood, and the future of Chinese power is uncertain. Power itself is a nebulous concept. Power can be relative. It can be absolute. It can be perceived and anticipated. So how can we decipher power? Through China Power, CSIS unpacks the complexity of China's rise by analysing the key components of Chinese power. What are China's strengths? What are its weaknesses? Does China's rise present a threat or an opportunity? Or both? What questions are you asking? Join the conversation at chinapower.csis.org.
I believe in strong alliances, clarity in dealing with our rivals.
What is the very last
and I take the oil.
Populism, border walls, retrenchment, and protectionism. While foreign policy is often overshadowed by economic concerns, contrasting visions of America's role in the world have played a major part in the recent election cycle. This contentious campaign season saw some of the basic tenets of U.S. foreign policy since the end of World War II called into question. Does this heightened acrimony over key aspects of U.S. international engagement reflect trends toward isolationism? It may seem unprecedented, but it is in fact not new. Today's controversies are continuations of debates that have lasted for decades. While support for the nation playing an active part in global affairs has remained strong since 1947, public opinion on key components of U.S. international engagement, such as defense spending, has waxed and waned over the last 70 years in response to economic trends, military interventions, and domestic priorities. In the first decades of the Cold War, America was committed to international engagement as a part of its strategy of containment against the existential threat presented by the Soviet Union. The U.S. experience in Vietnam, however, created an aversion to overseas military engagements that lasted from the late 1960s through the 70s. During the 1990s, the collapse of the Soviet Union led the U.S. public and policymakers to again question defense spending levels, foreign aid, and forward military presence. Many thought the limited interventions of Desert Storm in Kosovo would serve as models for future military operations. Then came September 11, 2001. Our response to the events of that day have largely defined contemporary American foreign policy since. First came the long wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Their unsatisfactory outcomes left much of the public and policymaking elites disillusioned with large-scale military engagements. The result of that disillusionment has been an increasing reliance on small footprint forces for a variety of contingency operations, including in the global war on terror. At home, the most severe recession since the Great Depression exacerbated America's growing reservations about global engagement. As the economy recovered at an anemic pace, income inequality ballooned. Fewer were able to reap the benefits of our globalized economy. Opposition to free trade and large-scale immigration grew. Now, 8 years after the recession and the more than 15 after 9/11, views on the desirability of America's international engagement strategy are fractured. For the first time ever in 2009, and again in 2013, most Americans responded that the U.S. should mind its own business internationally and let other countries get along the best they can on their own. This comes at the same time that more people are concerned about major domestic terror attacks than in 2002, just months after 9/11. Do these polls reflect temporary reactions to the state of public affairs? Or is there a genuine trend toward retrenchment in the American public? Democrats and Republicans now disagree on the benefits of free trade, alliances, and multilateral approaches. Divergences in threat perceptions and approaches to international engagement have also grown between the American public and policymakers. As history shows, this is not a new debate in American politics. Yet, as distance from World War II and the Cold War grows, the rationale for a U.S. foreign policy of engagement may be growing less clear to younger generations. If the new administration decides that sustaining a strategy premised on deep international engagement is best suited for the advancement of American interests, it will have to do a better job of communicating the rationale for those policies to create a foreign policy the American public can get behind. If, on the other hand, the new administration seeks to chart a new course for American foreign policy, it will have to find avenues of consensus among an increasingly fractured public.
mid-career where you realize, for some reason, my colleagues are moving up and I'm not. When you've been working really hard, checking all of those boxes that people tell you to check, and you're somehow hitting some type of glass ceiling and you're not entirely sure how to move up.
Once you get on the path, how do you find the wherewithal, the resources, the community of folks that can help you to continue to grow yourself and make yourself aware of opportunities?
Diversity in our national security is essential. The purpose of our project in diversity and leadership in foreign affairs and international affairs is to bring new voices and diverse perspectives to important discussions in foreign affairs and international affairs writ large.
People who come from such a wide range of backgrounds, they have language skills, they know how to operate interculturally with our counterparts on the other side of the table. We have this rich, untapped potential. How do we make the most of it and really get it into positions that can have an impact?
It's a signpost. It lets you know that there are people who come from places like yours, who look like you do, who share certain types of cultural affinities, certain types of struggles.
I've seen already that you get better reactions in diplomacy, you get better buy-in when you're trying to move forward with development efforts, and you have people sort of understanding that this might be a model that could work for their countries as well.
Defense Secretary Jim Mattis has called Iran the biggest destabilizing force in the Middle East. Keen on ending its own relative isolation, Iran portrays its security posture as defensive, a type of self-reliant deterrence against adversaries bent on keeping it weak. This posture manifests in aggressive and subversive ways, and Iran has used a range of military and paramilitary tools that serve to destabilize the region. Although the JCPOA has curbed Tehran's nuclear program for the next 10 to 15 years, the United States and its allies have been unable to deter Iran's incremental extension of regional power. The Trump administration and Congress will need to evaluate and prioritize their objectives in Iran and in the Middle East to counter Iran's destabilizing activities. There are several policy pathways the Trump administration could take, each presenting opportunities and risks for U.S. interests. One pathway for the administration could be to uphold the Iran nuclear deal while working to clarify any gray areas in implementation, including capping Iran's missile development. Some powerful factions in Iran would most certainly resist this effort, potentially undermining the influence of Iranian leaders willing to work with the United States, and would likely seek further concessions from the United States and its allies. A second pathway could be to disrupt the actions of the IRGC and undermine Iran's cyber activities through targeted military and financial operations, and by undercutting local support for IRGC activities. This pathway, however, could lead to an Iranian response including kinetic and cyber offensives against the United States and regional partners. A third pathway could be to challenge Iranian maritime aggression in Gulf waters by taking a more assertive stance in enforcing the rules of engagement for U.S. personnel in the Gulf. This pathway could risk escalation in the narrow Gulf waters of the Strait of Hormuz. A fourth pathway could focus solely on upholding the nuclear deal to ensure that it is not derailed by internal and external pressures in the U.S. or Iran. This pathway would likely lead to continuing Iranian provocations and non-nuclear capability development that may increase absent a response from the United States and its partners. Ultimately, the Trump administration and Congress must create a holistic strategy that accounts for a range of Iranian objectives and activities. This would include a commitment to uphold and strengthen the nuclear deal, working with allies and partners to step up counterterrorism efforts against Iranian proxies, sustaining financial pressure and incentivizing Iranian cooperation where possible, and countering Iranian activities along the spectrum of conventional and unconventional operations.
Currently, India ranks 54th on the World Bank's Logistics Performance Index,
more than 20 spots below manufacturing competitors like China and Malaysia. This is a major challenge for Modi's Make in India initiative. For example, India's truckers report that 15% to 25% of travel time is actually spent waiting at the heavily enforced state border checkpoints. They pay as much as $1.1 billion a year in bribes to state officials. The main problem is that India does not have a single national market. Its 29 states and 7 union territories each have their own system of sales taxes. As a result, internal borders look more like international ones. The version of the goods and services tax sitting before Parliament isn't perfect, but it will cut down on transit time for goods, paperwork for businesses, and could add 0.5% to annual economic growth. A seamless national tax environment will help Indian commerce flow more quickly.
Air power and military space systems have revolutionized the way the U.S. military operates, and the global economy increasingly depends on reliable and secure access to space systems. The Aerospace Security Project at CSIS examines the technological, budgetary, and policy issues affecting the air and space domains. Our research is focused in 3 areas. Space security examines the evolving military uses of space and how the lack of norms of behavior can affect escalation and deterrence. It explores how alternative architectures and new space capabilities can enhance the resilience of U.S. military space systems. Air dominance and long-range strike looks at the future of air and missile forces in a more contested operating environment. It examines the role of stealth, unmanned systems, and autonomous systems, how these capabilities can be integrated to enable new operational concepts, and options for the air and ground-based legs of the nuclear triad. Commercial and civil space explores international partnerships in space, efforts to reduce the cost of launch, advances in commercial space technologies.
Good afternoon, everyone. I feel like I'm welcoming everyone back to school. This is sort of our first event beginning in the fall. Good afternoon, my name is Heather Conley. I'm Senior Vice President here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and I have a great back-to-school event with 2 fantastic colleagues who have agreed to come to have a chat with us about a challenging subject, a subject that is challenging both Europe and the United States, and that is the rise of populism and nationalism. And we almost started this conversation in the back before we came out, and I said, wait, we got to get out here, and we have to have it with all of you. Please join me in welcoming Radek Sikorski, who is my favorite title. You carry many, but my favorite title for Radek is Distinguished Statesman, affiliated with the Brzezinski Institute on Geostrategy at CSIS, and I assure you we have benefited greatly from having Radek's keen insights and advice. When he's not helping CSIS, Radek currently serves as a senior fellow at the Center of European Studies at Harvard University. He has had a distinguished career in public service in Poland, serving as Poland's defense minister, foreign minister, and speaker of the parliament over a decade lasting from 2005 to 2015. But before that, he was a war correspondent, and he served as a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. And then we are so delighted to have Ed Luce join us, Washington columnist and commentator with the Financial Times. Reading Ed is sort of a morning must when it is time to read his column. He has been a long-standing colleague at the Financial Times, serving as Philippines correspondent, Central Asia Bureau Chief in Delhi, and then, of course, the Washington Bureau Chief from 2006 to 2011. He has been a great student of Washington and a great author. Just recently written the book, The Retreat of Western Liberalism, and it couldn't be a more perfect topic. So, Radek and Ed, we thought we'd just jump in, eschew all the formal remarks to start into our conversation. And as Bob Schieffer, who frequently moderates some of our conversations here at CSIS, he always says, let's start with the news. So we're going to start with the news and start with the outcome of the German elections on Sunday. There was a narrative, particularly after the Brexit referendum, after the US presidential election, that said, you know what, we had this fit of populism and nationalism. Europe took a look at it and said, nope, we're not going to do that. The Dutch elections, Geert Wilders was not successful. He was the second largest party. The French elections presidential elections turned out well. Phew, Europe has stemmed the tide. And then we had a historic result with the Alternative for Deutschland receiving 13% of the vote on Sunday. What did the German elections tell you, Roddick, about populism and nationalism in Europe?
They confirm my view that it's not just about economics. If you look at the map of support for parties and the weakening of CDU and the strengthening of AfD, you will see that the strongest showing for AfD is in the former DDR. Now, which is the part of Germany that has relatively benefited by far the most over the last 25 years? Of course, the former DDR. So despite that improvement, people are voting against the establishment parties. Indeed, in some constituencies in the former DDR, AfD even won. So this is deeper. It confirms the experience of Poland. I mean, there are similarities, rural versus urban and all that. But the quasi-Marxian explanation, the economic base, determining the ideological superstructure doesn't work. Because Poland is also a country that has been recently extraordinarily successful. We are going through the most successful 30 years in our 1,000-year history. We ended the 1980s at our poorest in peacetime in history, at about 35% GDP per capita by comparison with Western Europe. We're now at close to 70%. So an amazing success. And yet the populist vote was quite strong in Poland as well. So I believe it's to do with the politics of resentment. So for example, in the former communist bloc, I think, particularly for older generation, it's to do with the fact that they remember times when we were all poorer but equal, and now some people have succeeded beyond anybody's wildest imaginations. That is causing resentment, and there are leaders who have found ways of exploiting that resentment.
And many have suggested it's really not the German election outcome is really the normalization of German politics. They now finally have a far-right party in Germany. The story was really about the collapse of the political center, the center-left, the Social Democrats, the Christian Democratic Union. Do you see a sense that the political center in Europe, in the United States, is experiencing a fundamental collapse?
Whether it's collapse or, I mean, I use the word retreat, is something you can get into. But, you know, yesterday, your characterization of the populist wave having been broken until yesterday, I kind of disagree with, because yesterday, fewer than 1 in 7 Germans voted for an extremist party. By German standards, this was really bad. Never before, since the Basic Law in 1949, has a far-right party exceeded the 5% threshold, and it did in droves. And so it's bad news by German standards. But actually, it is the least bad outcome for the extreme right of all the elections that we've had since the twin sort of bombshells of 2016, namely Brexit and Trump. So you look at the Austrian presidential election, where an extreme right nationalist, Austrian nationalist, to put it politely, lost with 46% of the vote. You look at Geert Wilders, you'd mentioned, came second, but only because the ruling Mark Rutte's party had stolen a lot of his clothes. And then in France, Macron won handsomely, but a neo-fascist candidate got 34% of the vote. So 13% in Germany is actually relatively good compared to that. Is it economic anxiety or what American pollsters euphemistically call cultural anxiety that is behind this? It's clearly both. And they interact, they brew in different ways in different countries. I certainly wouldn't want to begin to comment on Poland or the other Visegrad countries. I just don't know them, and Radek obviously knows them intimately, particularly Poland. But I don't think that you can explain in this country or in Britain the degree to which charlatans have come to the stage and exploited the resentments Radek very correctly identified without understanding the economic anxiety that's been building up amongst the middle classes for a long time. I'll just make one other point, which is Hillary Clinton's book, What Happened, which I read 10 days ago and reviewed, and to my great astonishment, enjoyed reading it. It was well written, in great contrast to her previous two, Hard Choices and Living History. This was Hillary Unleashed. It was Hillary sarcastic. It was Hillary as we might have liked to see her on the podium when she was a candidate. And she goes into what was it that caused her to lose last November. Jim Comey was clearly one factor. Voter suppression in states like Wisconsin, which she shouldn't have lost, and Ohio, ditto, 2 million fewer voters. Jill Stein got more votes than she lost by in those three states. Hillary calling people deplorable was a tactical mistake. She goes through a whole litany of possible reasons that tipped it to Trump. And it begins to read like Agatha Christie's Murder on the Orient Express. There are like so many fingerprints on this dagger. Who's to say which was the first one to plunge it into the corpse of her campaign? But the real question to ask is how on earth Trump got to within spitting distance, win or lose, in the first place. How did he get the GOP nomination? And it's really hard to explain that without the economics and the race. They're both deeply sort of bound up together in what led to this hostile takeover of the Republican Party. So I think there is a false debate between culture on the one side and economics on the other. This is a toxic brew that we're seeing in different forms in different countries.
Absolutely, please.
But let's also remember that luck matters. I mean, Hillary actually did get more votes. And in Poland, the populists also got a minority. They got lucky, 38%. They won complete control over the legislature on 38% of the vote, because two left-wing parties eliminated themselves by not making the threshold. And on the other hand, in France, we got lucky. So it looks inevitable, but actually very small swings are sometimes decisive. I agree with you that the economy is important, but I'm not sure it's about growth or prosperity or numbers, because Poland, again, is a persuasive counterexample. We did not have a single year of recession, even at the height of the financial crisis. Poland has been growing every year for 25 years. So we haven't had a crisis. I think it's to do with a perception that capitalism, the model of capitalism we have now, has ceased to be fair. And people have access to information. They know how everybody lives. They know how much tax they pay, they hear how much the rich pay, and they hear how much the global corporations pay. And this is what annoys people, I think. And it also starves the nation states of resources that are needed to do the things that command the loyalty of the citizens.
Yeah, look, if you have the state retreating from its role of providing assistance, rainy day assistance, transition between jobs assistance, the basic social insurance that the state has been providing at a time of rising immigration. So you're widening access to a reduced benefit. You're going to get the politics of scapegoating. And as I say, you're going to get charlatans who come in and exploit this. So I think the retreat of the state is a huge explanatory factor. Why is Canada not experiencing this kind of populism? Why are we all sort of looking at Canada and thinking, oh, this Justin... I mean, Canada's not even boring at the moment. It's interestingly stable. It's got an attractive leader. I think the Canadian state spends a far higher share of GDP, quite efficiently. So it's roughly the same as Britain, but it's much better directed on social assistance. And I think as a result, you have less. There is populism there, but it's under a lid. So
Yeah, I mean, I might, thinking about Denmark spends 56% of its GDP on social welfare. The Danish People's Party, you have the Swedish model. Sweden's Democrats are now growing. Even the French state, very state interventionist in its policies, yet you still have this growing anxiety, or I would say a love-hate relationship with the state. We hate the state when it cannot perform the duties that we wish, but yet we need the state when it comes to hurricane relief and border security and security. It is that tension of state and what that role is. I think it's part of that conversation. Let me turn to, and I want to keep focusing on the political contours and this sense of the political center. The establishment parties, whether those are on the left and the right, just can no longer feel like they can maintain control over the political process. And it's what we've seen as by way of movement. So, and I'm going to turn to the UK. In some ways, many have compared Jeremy Corbyn's rise as head of the Labour Party to a movement. Very young people, many have said the analogous to the U.S. is Bernie Sanders, Senator Sanders, and his movement of young people that are taking power away from the established political parties or the MPs. You see Macron create a movement from the left and the right to try to reform. Are movements now replacing political party structures, or can they? Help us understand in some ways the rise of Jeremy Corbyn, who may be on the cusp of someday becoming Prime Minister of the UK.
So, I mean, one factor we haven't mentioned that's sort of hidden in plain view is technology, the role of technology in politics. And, what the impact technology has had is it makes it much, much easier to campaign and much, much easier to target, micro-target, subliminally advertise, reach voters of different categories, giving them different messages without them knowing. And managing the business of campaigning and elections in a far, far more sophisticated way. And that continues all the time. It's kind of exponentially to get more sophisticated. But at the same time, this technology makes it far more difficult to govern. And so I think the political parties, take Trump and the Republican nomination, a primary process. Political parties used to basically sift out the more dangerous and the more dubious candidates in the primary process. The party had more of a control over the process. That's been getting less and less and less, and the Republicans, basically, there are no superdelegates left. They have been disintermediated, just like the media has been disintermediated. And so you have a candidate like Trump with no previous political experience, and this is a first in American presidential history, with no previous elected office or not having worn a uniform. No one's reached the presidency beforehand, unless they fit one of those two categories, able to whip up and reach people beyond the party, outside the sort of the gatekeeping structure, to propel himself to the top. Jeremy Corbyn is actually remarkably similar story, as is Bernie Sanders. So I think technology is sort of giving a sort of electrifying effect to the anyway deep disenchantment with politics as usual, and with establishments and established parties. And if you combine technology with that, it's an extremely ripe circumstances for people to build movements. Whether those movements last or are coherent, I don't know if you've been watching the Labour Party conference, in Britain that's going on at the moment.
It's been a
there's
show.
Like a Venezuela-Cuba celebration going on there. I'm not sure this actually delivers. Well, it might deliver an election victory because you've got Theresa May as Prime Minister, but I'm not sure it's going to deliver a lasting, coherent program for government.
Roderick, what's your sense of the political party structures? In some ways, what we've really been seeing is a disintegration of the center-left. Certainly, that was the case in Poland, where there's really not a functioning left, which has really splintered the right. And to distinguish oneself on the right, it has become more how far right can you go? Is that a challenge that you're seeing? I would argue the same as in Hungary. There is no left. There is only right, Fidesz, and then extreme right, anti-Semitic, Jobbik. Is a problem we don't have a balance. You need a loyal opposition, a robust opposition for a well-functioning democracy. Is that something that we're seeing here? And I don't know if that's the case here in the United States.
Well, I think Edward has already hinted at this. The parties have weakened everywhere. The Tory party in Britain used to be a multi-million member organization. In Poland, we've had mass parties before, and now you can win power with just a few thousand people that you mobilize only for the time of the election campaign. And you can even do without them occasionally, as we've seen in Italy. And the trouble in some countries is that once you gain power and you take over the state media and you take over state funds and access to, you can then remake the public sphere according to your preferences, and that's very, very dangerous. In all this, we should also remember that in our social interactions, I believe we are only half rational. There are normal times when we make consumer-like choices in the political sphere, but it was already George Orwell in his review of Mein Kampf who said that the tepid values of liberalism lose with the more atavistic feelings of belonging, of tribe, of flag waving. And maybe one way of looking at what's happening now is that after a generation of growth, of prosperity, with some anxiety, of course, people have let their head down and want to see something more exciting. Some of these votes are actually quite frivolous.
Sure.
Electorates also have responsibility. If you vote for politicians that you wouldn't buy a second-hand car from, well, you should expect consequences.
Sure. But let me just push back a little bit. Mein Kampf, Orwell's review of Mein Kampf, is written at a time when there's a Nazi party that is taking working class votes. The SPD is what it took from, it's kind of echo, I'm not making any comparison, but this is what the AfD did to the SPD on Sunday too. It took a lot of votes from them. And the traditionally working class centre-left party basically gives seeds to the rise of the Nazi party. This is at a time of acute economic distress. So, I think the cultural viciousness, hopefully unique historical cultural viciousness of Nazism shouldn't blind us to the fact that the rise of extremist parties, came in an economic crater situation in Europe in the late 20s, early 1930s. There's nothing comparable economically now, and I do appreciate your point about Polish per capita income growth. But if you look at the middle classes in Britain and the United States and in France, and their economic pessimism about prospects for their children, you cannot explain what's going on unless you take that into account. But Poland and the other Visegrad countries, I think there is something different, and I'm fascinated at your explanation. I've always used to think of Poland as a sort of collectivist Catholic, social Catholic, Pope John Paul II, slightly left-leaning on many issues. And since your party lost power, what's it, 2012? 2014, I'm sorry. You've become kind of a right-wing Catholic. How do you explain it? You've hinted at your explanation, but I'd love to hear more.
Well, we have a ruling party which has gained the support of its base, partly Trump-like, on the basis of conspiracy theories. This was very important building block of the of the ideological mix, the belief that the 2010 crash of the presidential plane, in which the brother of the current leader of Poland died, that this was an assassination for which somehow Russia and the then government that I was a part was to blame. There's no shred of evidence for it, yet a third of the population believes it. I mean, the functional equivalent would be if one of the American parties made it official policy that 9/11 was carried out by the CIA. And yet, this is politically efficient. It's very difficult to confront rationally.
Going back on your, is this a question of we do not remember our history, that this is the complacency of advanced democracies, that we don't understand that we have to keep working on this, that there's an arrogance in some ways, whether that's the meritocracy or established parties, there's an arrogance that look, this is the system. I mean, and this is what I get to, you heard Hillary Clinton say deplorables. Emmanuel Macron just called protesters, slackers and cynics and extremists. We aren't treating each other with respect, even though we may have different ideas about what's going on in our world. And I think there's a missing vocabulary.
Look, the phenomenon of protest parties galvanizing some section of the population to protest a grievance, and then mainstream parties taking on some of that, that's old as democracy itself. But I agree with you in what you said right at the beginning, namely that we have a return of bad ideas. And national socialism, nationalism in the cultural spheres, statism in the economic sphere. And we've tried this before, and we know what it leads to. And it just seems to me that that this kind of ideological nostalgia is a little bit like a financial crisis. It happens, as you say, when we've forgotten what it was like the last time. And this is very worrying, and we just don't know whether the center will hold. You have two types of leaders. We have leaders that exploit what's worse in our nature, what we, our fears and our atavisms, and then there are leaders who give hope, who trade in hope, and we need a few more of those.
Ed, what is your reflection as you're watching the Trump administration over the last 9 months, reflecting on your view of populism and nationalism as it has been expressed? Ed was telling us this poor man, he's been doing so much, obviously, on the camp, the presidential...
I didn't describe myself as a poor man.
No, these are my words.
I'm very happy.
He's so stressed, he's been working so hard, and his wife said, you know what, you need to get away. I'm going to take you to an NFL game. Get away from politics. And so on Sunday, he went to the Bears-Steelers game, and what broke out? A whole lot of politics.
I hate to admit, but guiltily admit, but since I don't understand pro football that well, I'm very up with baseball. I understand basketball. NFL has always been a bit of a foreign language to me. I was going there thinking, am I going to understand anything that goes on? Then, of course, Friday night, Trump politicizes the thing, and then the Pittsburgh Steelers don't come out, all but one refuses to leave the locker room for the Star-Spangled Banner, and it was quite extraordinary. At Soldier Field, the largely sort of older white crowd who were there to see the Bears, as this young, mostly black team then took the field. The boos, get to your own country. If you don't like America, leave this country. And immediately I thought, okay, I'm at a Trump rally. I felt quite that I'd seen this before and I understood the rules. Then there was a very interesting game, and so that was kind of over. What is happening? Look, Trump is tonight going to face a really big decision in Alabama. Does Roy Moore, who's kind of in some ways the Trumpian figure there in Alabama, level of sort of outrage this man can generate has served him extremely well in stoking up the base, name recognition, being a lightning rod to express people's contempt for politics. If he wins, Trump having backed Luther Strange, and therefore Bannon wins and Trump loses, Trump's going to be desperately seeking after the base that seems to have just temporarily left him or hadn't been listening to him. And he tried this with the NFL tweets, racializing, an entire conversation. He's tried this over the last 3 days. He's continuing to. What he will do if Bannon wins tonight, I do dread. This is cultural sort of demagoguery and racialized demagoguery at its worst. And we've never seen a US president do this. So what will happen? I don't know. Your larger question, the future of Trump. Ladbrokes, the British betting agency, which has a fairly liquid contract in American political futures, because you don't do it here, has a 50% chance that Trump will be impeached. But it also has a different contract, 50% chance he'll serve out two full terms.
8 years, yeah.
So that's spread betting for you.
Well, that covers all your bases.
That covers all your bases.
Let me turn a little bit to looking towards the future and the future of populism and nationalism and its policy impact. Here you have Brexit, which will be hugely consequential for the United Kingdom, for the future of the European Union. The populism and nationalism that has come to the United States has shaken America's leadership role in alliances and free trade agreements and sort of the world order as we've understood it in the post-Cold War context. We're now, I think, entering a very different sphere. Roderick, what concerns you the most as you look across this transatlantic landscape in this rising tide of populism and nationalism, and holding on to these institutions that were very much created to hold those forces at bay, the European Union, obviously, and NATO to provide that greater security. As Lord Ismay said, the first NATO Secretary General, NATO was designed to keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. That was its founding, in some ways, quality. What does this mean for institutional development multilaterally?
And we might now have to go to war on behalf of the United States for the second time if a North Korean missile reaches Guam, which is odd, but actually by treaty we would be obliged to. Look, Poland is a member of the Neutral States Supervisory Commission of the Armistice. And partly because of that, I visited North Korea more than once. And I'm very worried about the developments because both leaders, but don't have any influence over the man in North Korea, but the President of the United States has deprived himself of the classical tool of diplomacy, which is to be able to play the escalation ladder, namely that you first allow your underlings to send a tough message, to escalate, so that when you are about to act, you issue a warning at the head of state level, which then has some credibility. Yeah. And what I fear is that with the messaging that we have, when the President of the United States gets tough and real and final, he will not be believed. And therefore, the potential for miscalculation is huge. But coming back to Brexit, I think it's a case study of how you can bamboozle a whole population into making an irrational decision on the basis of completely false information. If you've lived in Britain until a few months ago, because paradoxically, the British people are only now learning about how the EU actually works. What is the customs union? What is a single market? What's a directive? What's a regulation? Before that, you were relying on your veto, and you didn't need. And the nationalist press was willfully misportraying the European Union, and the politicians were too cowardly to explain it. And this is where we are. And the meeting with reality of either caving to the treaty structures or having a very painful exit is going to be very painful for Britain and for the Tory party in particular. And I don't know how you tell me how to avoid a Corbyn prime ministership, because I don't see it.
It's a very good question. I mean, I'll say one thing for this referendum. You mentioned errors and accidents and leaders and good leaders and bad leaders. The expert class, or the sort of reputation of expertise, had suffered some pretty damaging blows. I mean, the same people who said stay in Europe, stronger together, the Cameron, the Blair types, had not foreseen 2008, the crash, and then bailed out all the banks, which was the right thing to do, but very much against the sort of popular anger at the banks. They had missold the Iraq war. I mean, the expert class had not had a very stellar record, and so there was a depth of cynicism that I think was a perfect storm for the Brexit referendum, which is, we just don't believe you. But there was also gross incompetence. You know, as you know, David Cameron held the election, the referendum, on June 23rd, with the rules that university students have to go back to their university town in order to vote. Now, it's not that they thought these students would go from whatever, Sussex to Edinburgh, you know, just to exercise one vote. They thought they wouldn't need them because it was such a large margin they were going to win by anyway. So these sort of unforced errors are also part of the explanation. I do think the fact that, for want of a better term, in the popular demotic, this class, this elite, suffers no consequences for their errors is perfectly personified by David Cameron. Walking away from Downing Street whistling, getting nice speeches from banks, you know, £100,000 a shot, no consequences for this gross unforced error that he visited on the British people. Will Corbyn become Prime Minister? Quite possibly. You know, my even less expert, but perhaps better wordsmith colleagues in the British tabloid media are very good with wordplay in their headlines. And, you know, headlines about Theresa May with dismayed, mayhem, Mayday. And, you know, my thought is the expert class would be getting on the Mayflower to America were it not the fact that you've got similar problems over here. Theresa May, as the joke goes, is the worst Prime Minister Britain has had since David Cameron. And so Jeremy Corbyn might, as an accident, disastrous as accident would be, the beneficiary from this.
Well, I have to say, watching the referendum and the assault on expertise, which I have to say, in some ways we feel here. Part of that is no one accepted responsibility for a lot of bad calls, a lot of misjudgments. And so that part and parcel. But the rejection of outside groups, and this was the famous Michael Gove
rejection
BBC.
Of facts.
Well, yes, but I will say some of the people that were predicting the world would come to an end if the British people voted to leave the EU. They waited for that next moment to come. The world didn't stop spinning.
Because Brexit hasn't happened yet.
Correct. But I'm just saying, you know, this is sort of the irresponsibility of it, but I think the collateral analysis now, they're ejected from the playing field. Now it's just hurdling false narratives and false information. And it almost becomes, if you believe nothing is true, everything is possible. If you don't believe anything, you're very susceptible to the fear-mongering, the demagoguery. And if there are leaders that choose to use that, in some ways, we've created an open field. It's the consequences of the last 2 decades of policy decisions, policy failures, lack of leadership, the complacency of liberalism in some ways. And boy, we are reaping
and
what
the collapse
we sow.
of traditional media.
And so you both are really focusing on the media, the technology, and obviously we're getting a little bit of analysis of how foreign powers can use technical means to help shape influence and voters, and whether that's through Facebook, whether that's Twitter and Instagram. We have
But you know, some of us were warning the United States that what was coming. I received exactly the same messages from the same servers, from the same Russian group, when I was foreign minister and Speaker of Parliament, that John Podesta received. I just didn't press the button. And we were warning you that this is coming. Poland, in that sense, was a laboratory, and a successful one. And you know, there was a certain amount of confidence that you can do it to smaller countries, but nobody would dare do it to the United States. Well,
yeah. Ed?
I agree with that. Yeah, I'm not going to comment on Poland. I mean, I know, and you were also, subjected to intel operations, weren't? Didn't they sort of bug you and then release tapes and?
We don't know yet to what extent that was a domestic operation.
Oh, okay.
And,
interesting.
...
So I want to make a different point. I mean, that we were actually discussing earlier, which is about the self-negating problems with meritocracy, and we were both agreeing on this point. The person who coined the term, Michael Young, when he wrote the book, The Rise of the Meritocracy in 1958, actually predicted its ultimate demise, and he had a very precise date, 2033, which was what most people wouldn't benefit from a meritocratic system, because it would, some people have more merit than others and more market value than others, and will, but also because those who did become the meritocratic elites would have certain resources, what we now call social capital, to perpetuate that through their children, and you would get a hereditary meritocracy. That's kind of what's happened. It's kind of what's happened. We in the elites, you look at legacy places at the Ivy League universities, you look at the extraordinary social capital that kids who go to better schools in better zip codes get, and that huge advantage, the free internships, etc. Huge advantage that bestows on them in this meritocratic system. Then there is, at a time of fairly deep stagnation in the middle of those who are not part of the meritocratic elite, there is, I think, an understandable resentment at the feelings of just desserts that those who are at the top. I mean, think of Chelsea Clinton. Think of people in my profession and the resentment that they felt when she got her first job in media at NBC for $600,000 a year, and did I don't want to pick on her. I'm told she's very nice, very bright, but she was kind of a lightning rod for that kind of feeling. Think of how most people believe that the system is rigged. Is that a myth? Is that anti-fact? Is that fake news? I'm not sure it is. I think it creates a perfect storm of cynicism and the kind of resentment where fake news can thrive. But I think there is justified skepticism about how fair this system is.
I agree that the social contract under which rewards are apportioned to various groups has been skewed. I mean, Wall Street bankers do a valuable job, some of them. But so do doctors. I mean, do they really deserve 1,000 times as much as a doctor? I have my doubts. And do you remember during the previous election campaign, Mitt Romney got into trouble when it turned out that he was paying less tax than his secretary, right? My American wife has two minimum standards for a candidate. Number one, they have to believe in the theory of evolution. And number two, they at least have to pay as much tax as their secretary.
Yeah.
And when you add to this the triumph of meritocracy, the fact that legislatures have been captured by special interests and rules have been bent to suit those with power, I agree, then resentment, but it comes from unfairness rather than from suffering, I think, or rather from poverty.
Yeah, no, there's no absolute poverty around. That's not part of the picture. I agree with that.
So perhaps what you're saying is liberalism has become undemocratic.
Oligarchic.
Oligarchic.
Look, no, I think liberals have abandoned some of the principles of liberalism. Look, when I was at university and we studied John Rawls, the theologian, if you like, of liberalism, one of the basic rules was that you should make, in choosing social arrangements, you should be blind about where in the social scale you would belong after they are made, right? So, one of the oldest principles you teach children, one person slices the cake and another person chooses which bite to have, which bit to have, right? And we've abandoned that, I'm afraid.
All right, we need to get our wonderful audience into this conversation. I could monopolize it the whole time. So we have some microphones. If you could just raise your hand, introduce yourself, and ask a question. And we will start up here in the front, Sir Max, and then we'll just move across to the front and then to Mike. Thank you. You have to speak very clearly into that
Dan
microphone.
Lieberman, yes, one thing that has been touched upon is somewhat psychological, that once people had low expectations and high aspirations, and as the economies prospered, the aspirations were met. So two things happened. When the aspirations were met, people found they were not quite satisfied, although their aspirations were met, and those people who had low expectations developed too high expectations, and those too high expectations could not be met. And so people sort of began to think and revert a little bit to the past and to their national identity rather than hope for a future and an international identity. And I wonder if that didn't play a big part.
Low expectations and high aspirations. Max, if you just go right there to the front. Thank you. We'll take a few.
Thank you. A British diplomat currently out of government for reasons that you might be able to deduce. I very much enjoyed your analysis. If you don't mind the observation, Radek, I still felt you had a bit more of the Hillary Clinton tone of blaming the voters for making wrong decisions and being susceptible, whereas I felt you, Edward, were more sympathetic to maybe there are structural factors that are providing fertile ground for these charlatans' ideas to take root. My question is, why are all the other politicians throwing themselves like lemmings down the same path? Why aren't there more John McCains willing to stand up and try and hold dear to the principles? And secondly, where are the leaders who are going to take us out of this mess, and how do they do it? Thank you.
Great question. Next, we'll go to Mike for the third one, and then I'll let Radek and Ed respond.
I'm Mike Haltzel from Johns Hopkins University SAIS. 2 points. One, I agree with Radek, his statement at the beginning talking about the politics of resentment. I think this is really key. And from resentment, one gets into scapegoating. And whether it's scapegoating the nouveau riche in Poland now, I mean, in the bad old days, it was the Jews. They're no longer there, so we can't do that. In the United States, it's immigrants, both legal and undocumented. And there's a healthy amount of racism there also. At the end of the discussion, though, I have to say, I think you really veered off when you talked about the negative side of meritocracy. Sure, there's always a negative side. You can't change your parents, and you're going to get a lot of parents are probably a more important educational influence on children than schools are. You can't change that. And the fact is, the arguments you were making are kind of ironic, because from the resentment side, people criticize affirmative action, which is as not being part of meritocracy. You're saying that the meritocracy is bad. In fact, most of the universities in this country try very hard to get balanced undergraduate student bodies on the basis of race and socioeconomic status and geography and whatever else. So I mean, it's a very complicated issue. Finally, Mr. Luce, you were talking about, I agree with you that that the danger from the right is less in Germany than it is elsewhere. But I think when, as Heather said, we're talking about the center collapsing. So you have to talk about the left also. And if you add to the votes the 12.6% of the Alternative für Deutschland, Die Linke, that got over 9%, then you're talking about close to 23%, and in the 5 former states of the GDR plus East Berlin, 40%. You mentioned Jill Stein. I have not read Hillary Clinton's book. She might have mentioned this, but Jill Stein's votes would have also given Hillary Clinton Pennsylvania. And what's interesting is, in that famous photograph of the banquet in Moscow for the Russian propaganda tool RT, when General Flynn was sitting next to Mr. Putin, guess who was sitting across the table?
Jill Stein.
Jill Stein.
Well, we have an ongoing debate about meritocracy. Where are the leaders, which is a fantastic opening. Are we blaming the voters? And are there other structural reasons? And this again of the expectations versus your aspirations. And this really gets to the future. I think leaders now, demagogues are using fear and different selective views of history for their purpose. Where is that aspirational, futuristic, we can do this? What is the narrative for the West going forward?
Well, first of all, I wasn't making the argument about universities. I was making a more general argument about rules being skewed to the advantage of those who already are powerful, and I think this is unanswerable. This is definitely so, and there are things that we could do about it to bring back a sense of fairness. Nation states, despite and I was in government for 14 years, despite what you read that global corporations are now more powerful than nation states, this is not true. We can regulate this stuff. There is nothing except the special interests to stop us from abolishing anonymous corporations, for example. We could take the work that's been done for decades by OECD about tax havens and finally do it. We could ban corporations from OECD recognized tax havens from, for example, public procurement or from operating in our jurisdictions. We could do more. We could make it a criminal offense for our citizens to hold accounts in tax havens. What is the purpose of these tax havens except to hide ill-gotten gains or reduce your tax burden? I mean, there are some minor, tiny, legitimate uses of them that don't justify the huge loss of revenue and the huge unfairness involved. Take London. 36,000 houses in London whose ownership is unknown. The UK government could pass a law saying within 6 months everybody has to own up what they own. After that they pay tax if they don't, and a year after that they lose the house. You can do it. More than that, they could say, if you live in Britain, you own a house in Britain, you are a resident for tax purposes and you will pay a UK income tax, which would be the standard procedure in this country. There are things we can do, but it just takes a certain courage. And what I fear is that if we don't do it, then Jeremy Corbyn and others will do it much more radically and with much more collateral damage, if you like.
So I'll make a couple of points. First, your point about meritocracy. The income statistics in America over the last 30 years point very, very clearly to a dramatic and very un-American decline in income mobility. America now has lower income mobility than the rest of the OECD. It's down there at the bottom with Britain, I'm sorry to say, for both of us. But this is a very American thing. Your chances of getting from one income group you were born into another used to be higher in this country than anywhere else. That was the American dream, by dint of your own efforts. It's now the lowest chance of any country. Canada is where the American dream, to some degree Germany is where the American dream is way more possible. And there are any number of sort of ways of skinning this cat and looking at what I believe is a very real problem. So I disagree with you. I think university legacy places, the high share that legacy students take is one measure, but that's only one measure. The declining life expectancy of whole swathes of the American population is, in peacetime, an unprecedented problem. Now, is this just sort of resentment springing out of nowhere? I think you've got the cart and the horse mixed up here. I think that there is a stew of resentment that unscrupulous politicians can exploit and divert, and we've seen that in spades, sort of on an Olympic scale in the last year. But the fact that people don't believe the system is fair is not a fantasy, I don't think. I think it's deeply grounded in their experience and in the numbers the experts provide. So there's a kind of agreement, there's consensus on that point. So I would push back on you. I appreciate your points, but I disagree. Where do leaders come from? Well, Macron is definitely trying to lead. I don't think what happened in Germany on Sunday is going to help him. But I can think of some names. Let's choose Britain. Sadiq Khan is the mayor of London is a very interesting alternative and a far saner and more balanced and grounded alternative to Jeremy Corbyn. Nicola Sturgeon, although I don't agree with Scottish nationalism, is a very talented, sane leader. Here, there are people, we're still very early in the cycle, but if you're thinking about the Democratic nomination, there are names that we haven't yet really grappled with, like Chris Murphy of Connecticut. Quite talented people, I think, with great prospects. I'm not sure that Bernie Sanders is going to run. He's going to be 79 by 2020. Joe Biden will be not that much younger. There are quite a lot of septuagenarians vying. But I think if you look in the lower ranks, unfortunately not so much in the state capitals and the governor's houses, because the Democrats are not paying attention to that level. But if you look in the Senate, there is some talent. Just a final point about the lack of democratic sort of focus on the states. I think this is a huge, huge mistake. There's a democratic obsession with the White House. Republicans control 2/3 of legislative seats around the 50 states and can do enormous things with that. And there's a far more sort of long-term, if you like, Leninist strategy on the right. I guess because most Democrats live in cities and not in these states, they care less and they think more of the presidency. But it's a big, big strategic error for which they will pay far longer than they need to.
I want to close the conversation by asking the question that Marine Le Pen asked during the French presidential election. Are you a patriot or are you a globalist? And President Trump ended his UN General Assembly speech last week with the same question. Are we still patriots? Can we have a healthy nationalism? Can we be patriotic yet be hopeful, successful in a globalized world?
I regard myself as a patriot of my country, and I subjectively feel that I proved that by, I was, as you mentioned, a war correspondent in Afghanistan during the war with the Soviets. That was wasn't always a safe place to be in. But I think there are two ways of being a patriot. In Poland we regard the word solidarity as very important. Well, solidarity with your own tribe and only with your own kin, it doesn't fully express the meaning of the word, because that kind of sticking together just with your own is, not only human beings are capable of that. So your sense of belonging and your sense of patriotism has to be on several levels. First the family, charity begins at home, but then your region. In Europe we have municipal patriotism, we have regional patriotisms. Of course, the nation state is a very important one. For most of us, the most important locus of identity and of loyalty. But there are things that, as a Pole, I feel I need Europe to represent me and to protect my interests, because Poland is not capable of protecting all of the interests of its people. And then when you're faced with the kinds of disasters that we hear about all the time, Syria, hurricanes, you name it, we also, I hope many of us are globalists in terms of human solidarity, right? So to narrow this to just this kind of 19th century type of hostility of one group, nation state, and also, you know, in Europe, we know every frontier in Europe is accidental, is a result of history, every one of them. So to then grow politics on the basis of this one level of artificially arrived at solidarity is I think, too narrow.
I'm with Radek. I'm a patriot that not of the form that believes that we're inherently superior to others. I mean, I'm from Britain. I wish Britain very well because I'm from there and most of my family are there. But I understand that the challenges we face in Britain and other countries are the same. The transcendent challenges like climate change, like the destabilizing effects of great sort of uprootings and transitions around the world are only possible with deep cooperation between nations who face the same challenge, and that's all of us. Just to get back to the NFL thing and the flag.
I'm not talking about the New England Patriots.
Oh, I know. I mean, although I'm not American, you know, I've got a green card and I've lived here a long time, and I'm very fond of America, and I understand the protests. And as I think we were chatting earlier, kneeling, I don't think is disrespecting the flag. I think it's appealing to what America is best represents. And I think what really disrespects the flag, and thank you for reminding me of this, is showing the Confederate flag, which you see at every Trump rally. That disrespects the Stars and Stripes. So patriotism that is inclusive and can work with other countries is exactly, I think Radek defined it perfectly.
Well, this has been a great conversation, sobering, but I'm so glad we had two incredibly thoughtful people to help us navigate these challenging times, but I'm going to stay optimistic. We will push back this rising tide of populism and nationalism, and please join me in thanking Radek Sikorski and Ed Luce.
Thanks, Radek.